On May 28, 1971, a private plane flew straight into thick fog over the Virginia mountains and exploded. When rescuers found the wreckage scattered across Brush Mountain, America understood it had just lost someone who seemed impossible to kill. Audie Murphy, the soldier called the greatest hero of World War II, the man who once stood alone against an overwhelming German force, who survived the hell of the battlefield, only to die in a peacetime flight at the age of 45. That death was not merely an accident. It felt like a black period, casting a shadow over the golden legend of a perfect hero. Because behind the glittering medals and the Hollywood smile that once lit up movie theaters, Audie Murphy carried another war. A war no one could see. Nightmares that never ended, sleepless nights, a vigilance bordering on paranoia, and a mind that never truly made it home. He was America's living paradox. Talent and glory came far too early, but peace never came at all. So behind the family door, beyond the lights of Hollywood, who was Audie Murphy really? A hero broken by war, or a secret America never wanted him to speak aloud? To understand why a man who survived the war could still be caught by darkness, even after becoming a legend, we are forced to return to the starting point, a place with no medals, no cameras, only hunger, cold, and a childhood shredded by poverty. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20, 1925, in Kingston, Hunt County, Texas, into a family of tenant farmers so poor that life was measured in meals. He was the seventh of 12 children, growing up at a time when America was still barely crawling out of the Great Depression, and rural Texas was as unforgiving as sun-cracked earth. The house had nothing that could protect children from suffering. There were nights they went to bed with empty stomachs, and mornings they woke up with hunger burning inside them like an instinct they had learned to live with. In that kind of world, Audie was not allowed to be weak. Even as a small boy, he had to know how to hunt rabbits, track game, set traps for birds to bring meat home, not for play, but to feed younger siblings. Poverty was not just a lack of money, it was the feeling of having to grow up before your time, of a child looking into his mother's face and understanding that if he brought home nothing today, the whole family would go hungry. When he was still young, his father left the family, vanished from their lives, leaving behind an exhausted mother and a dozen children as if tossed into the wind. Audie kept growing, but he grew silent in the face of that emptiness. By around 5th grade, he had to quit school, taking whatever odd jobs he could and picking cotton for a few spare coins. But the most brutal blow came in 1941, when Audie was only 16. His mother died from illness. That death was not only an emotional loss, it shattered the final pillar holding the family up. After that, life no longer carried the shape of youth. His younger siblings were sent to orphanages, and Audie stood in the ruins of his family like a child forced to play the role of an adult. From that moment on, he didn't just carry a name, he carried responsibility. And it was in that darkness that something fierce began to form. A determination to escape fate, not to become famous, but to pull his loved ones out of poverty, out of ruthless living, out of the loop of abandonment. When war erupted and America entered the greatest conflict of the century, for many young men, it was a call of ideals. For Audie Murphy, it was also the only way out of hunger, out of powerlessness, out of standing there, watching his family fall apart with nothing he could do. Except even when he wanted to enter war, war might not accept him. Audie was small, only about 5 feet 5 inches and roughly 110 pounds, rejected by the Navy and the Marine Corps. But that was the kind of rejection that only made someone like Audie harder, because he had grown up hearing life say no. And Audie Murphy was not the kind of man who could stand still in front of a closed door. If he was turned away for being too small, he would find another way to become bigger. Through will. In 1942, as America was being swallowed into the machinery of war, Audie made a decision many would call reckless. He joined the army. Some accounts say he falsified his age to overcome paperwork barriers, because war would not wait for a Texas boy to become legally grown, and he no longer had the patience to wait. For Audie, it wasn't childish trickery. It was the only way to break out of a suffocating destiny and step into a life he believed he could take control of. Then everything moved so fast people couldn't fully understand it. A boy who once hunted rabbits to feed his siblings was now learning how to live inside explosions and fire. In July 1943, Audie tasted combat for the first time in Sicily. And that moment was like fate, violently flipping a switch. From then on, he was swept into the battlefield's non-negotiable rhythm. Campaigns one after another, roads through North Africa, then Italy, then France, then Germany. Each place, its own kind of hell. Each day, an exam with no second chance. Some soldiers entered war to prove themselves. Audie entered it as if there was no other choice except survival and victory. But legends are not made by simply serving in enough campaigns. Legends are made in a moment when everything ordinary inside a man is burned away, leaving only instinct, the decisiveness, and a cold willingness to risk death. And for Audie Murphy, that moment was stamped into history on January 26, 1945, near Holtzwihr, France. A tank destroyer was burning. Metal glowed white-hot. Smoke smothered the air. His unit was pushed to the edge of collapse. In a situation where most people would retreat to save their lives, Audie did the opposite. He climbed onto the flaming tank destroyer as if fire could not frighten him as much as the idea of his men being wiped out. And then he stood there, using its firepower to hold back an advancing German force, pinning them down with heavy bursts of gunfire and the unnatural calm of a man long familiar with death. Not a few seconds of reckless impulse. A confrontation long enough to become a symbol. One human being alone against a flood of armed men, in smoke, in detonations, in the knowledge that one missed beat meant extinction. After the war, numbers began chasing his name, as if the world was trying to measure what could not be measured. He was called the most decorated American soldier of World War II. Common records and retellings cite 33 medals and citations, a mountain of shining metal, none of which could explain the cost inside his body and his mind. Yet even as all that praise rained down, Audie still carried the same point of origin. The Texas boy who survived poverty with bare hands, and now survived war with a kind of courage that made all of America fall silent. From the very moment he was canonized by medals, Audie Murphy stepped out of one battlefield only to enter another, one without gunfire, yet hunted by something far more relentless, the gaze of the entire nation, and nightmares that refused to let go. In 1945, he returned from Europe not as a soldier coming home, but as a phenomenon America had just built. A photograph on the cover of Life magazine turned him into a national symbol in a single breath. The face still carrying the youth of a boy, but eyes holding the coldness of someone who had seen too much death. Parades, roaring cheers, handshakes that dragged on until they became suffocating. On the surface, it was glory, but the feeling was closer to being transferred from one camp to another. Audie had barely left the trenches before being placed inside a different cage, a cage called Icon. The cracks began to show quietly. By day, he stood straight in a perfectly tailored suit, smiling at the right moments, saying the right things, flawless in the way America needed him to be, as a form of self-comfort after war. By night, his body refused sleep. Battle fatigue in that era was not an illness to be treated. It was something to be hidden. A man hailed as the nation's #1 hero was not allowed to admit that he was afraid. And so he lived in peace while his nerves were never allowed to lower the rifle. Chronic insomnia, nightmares dragging the present back into yesterday, each day unfolding like a watch with no order to stand down. The more he was celebrated, the more he was forced to uphold an image he could no longer control. By 1948 to 1949, Audie refused to remain a character narrated by the press. He seized the right to tell his own story. His memoir, To Hell and Back, 1949, landed like a direct blow to the way people romanticized war. No lipstick on victory, no turning blood into legend, only fear, violence, and the cost of survival laid on the table. That blunt honesty drew enormous attention because readers could feel this was not propaganda. It was the voice of someone who had walked through hell and could still hear it inside his head. But the price of self-telling is always cruel. Every page was another act of dragging memory back, prying open a wound that had been trying to seal itself shut. Hollywood arrived at precisely that moment, like a massive machine that had caught the scent of profit. Cinema didn't just need an actor, it needed a real symbol so the audience would believe completely. Audie carried the perfect package: combat glory, a camera-ready face, a story America could take pride in. There was only one problem. Hollywood loved the beautiful version of him, while the darkness in him, sleepless nights, panic, the survival reflexes of a man who had lived under shell fire, had no place on a poster. He was expected to keep being the hero, even while his inner life was still relearning how to breathe like an ordinary man. In 1950, Universal signed him to a long-term contract and pulled him into the mainstream studio machine. For a boy raised in hunger, steady pay, and a structured work schedule felt like a miracle. But Hollywood wasn't paying for the real Audie Murphy. It was paying for an image, the small man with iron courage, eyes innocent, yet capable of turning cold as steel, a good boy who knew how to hold a gun. He didn't need to talk much. He only had to step into the frame so Americans could see what they wanted to see. In the early 1950s, Audie learned the craft in the harshest way. No school, no connections, only endurance. On set, he was disciplined like a soldier. No showmanship, no demands, working quietly and efficiently. That discipline fit the Western genre perfectly. It didn't require elaborate emotional fireworks. It needed a trustworthy face and a stance that made guns feel like a second language. Audie became the model of the silent hero, acting at the right moment, hiding everything behind his eyes, calm to the point that people believed he was born to be heroic. The only catch was that calm belonged to the screen. In real life, he had no such privilege. The more he played the hero, the more he was trapped in a brutal psychological snare. Every gunshot scene was like a knock against real memory. His every reenactment of war felt like being dragged back to a place he had never truly left. For Murphy, acting wasn't only a job, it was repetition, and he was forced to repeat it in order to live. The year 1951 brought a major opportunity and revealed the first bitter cruelty of the industry. In Hollywood, appearing in a prestigious film does not necessarily mean being recognized for what you are. The red badge of courage pulled Audie off the purely commercial Western track and toward more artistically ambitious cinema, a role that could have transformed a symbol into a serious actor. But the film was heavily interfered with in post-production. Test screenings disappointed. Cuts were made like a blade. The released version was shortened. Crucial sequences disappeared, weakening the work and causing an invisible blow to Audie. When audiences couldn't see a full film as it was meant to be, they also couldn't fully see an actor trying to step out of his own shadow. By 1952, he returned to the steady grind, just as if refusing to allow himself to stand still long enough to feel injustice. Westerns began to form into a pipeline, roles with few words, restrained eyes, endurance living beneath the surface. Everything war had carved into him, discipline, reflex, quietness, became something Hollywood could frame and sell as cinematic reliability. 1953 further cemented that professional stability. Audie worked like a true factory laborer of cinema. Arrive on set, complete the scenes, create no noise, live unlike a star. No parties, no social web. What he had was endurance, and in the studio machine, that became a rare kind of talent. By 1954, the Western path was nearly stamped in place with Ride Clear of Diablo and his collaboration with Jesse Hibbs. This was the kind of durable partnership that worked. A director who knew how to place Audie inside the right kind of story, and Audie delivering a sense of truth without overacting. That success made him a commercially reliable face for Universal, but it also locked him into an ever-tightening mold, the silent hero. While inside, he remained a man who could not truly be silent, a man living in glory, yet fighting every night just to survive. The real stamp arrived in 1955, a year that pushed Audie Murphy to the commercial peak, and at the same time shoved him into the box. Hollywood was determined to lock him inside. To Hell and Back was not an ordinary role. It was the moment America demanded that he reenact himself. The small soldier who had done the unimaginable, the survivor who returned as an icon. On screen, Audie was not only playing himself, he was also involved as a technical advisor, as if the war had never truly left the man. Only changed locations, from the forests of France to a film set. The production scale was fairly modest, around $500,000, but the film won in the way Hollywood craved most. Domestic rentals in the U.S. and Canada reached roughly $5,799,852, placing it among the notable box office performers of 1955. But Audie did not want to play himself at first. To him, it wasn't simply acting. It was dragging part of his memory out and exposing it again under lights, letting hundreds of eyes stare at it like a performance. In the end, he still had to say yes, because it was the surest major payday, a commercial opportunity impossible to refuse inside Universal's machine. And while people believed he was recreating a legend, in reality, he was reliving it every day, under a pressure more intricate than the battlefield itself. He was not allowed to weaken, not allowed to break, not allowed to admit that he was afraid. On set, there were times Audie reportedly carried real ammunition instead of props, a survival reflex too deeply embedded to control. The war no longer had real gunfire, but his nervous system still behaved as if 1 second of inattention could make everything collapse. The film helped America seal him as a living monument, but it also turned him into a prisoner of heroic roles, a clean, glorious frame in which he was always right while the real human being inside grew more disordered and exhausted. As the years 1956 to 1959 unfolded, Audie's career was steadily westernized into a money-making formula. Reliable films, a reliable work rhythm, posters that were easy to sell, audiences that were easy to convince. Yet that steady rhythm also signaled a tightening lock. Hollywood was no longer curious who he truly was. It only needed him to repeat the version it had already successfully packaged. In 1956, Walk the Proud Land appeared as an attempt to break out, a non-traditional Western with a more unusual ambition. It felt like a test to see whether Audie could go beyond the label of a gunslinging star. But the box office did not stand with the film, and that loss was enough to make the studio cautious. in the logic of profit, and experiments like that were unnecessary risks, especially for a name already viewed as a stable ticket-selling machine. In 1957, he returned to a continuous run of westerns, working at the pace of a man with no right to rest. The busier he was, the less time he had to face what was boiling inside his mind. This period also began to show small disruptions in schedule and projects, a sense that the gears, after turning too long, were starting to creak. There was a project he could not join because of scheduling issues, and such misalignments are often early signs of a larger struggle between the individual and the machine. The more Audie wanted to control his life, the more the system demanded he follow the timetable. By 1958, he suddenly made a rare turn: the quiet American. This was not a Western, not a dusty frontier, not a revolver formula. This was a rigid Cold War setting, with Vietnam in the frame, politics in the air, and Audie stepping into the role of Alden Pyle. The American, in the most dangerous sense, not merely present but consequential. Working with a major director and a project carrying a different weight, he had a chance to let audiences see him in a new skin. Less cowboy, more contradiction. But the moment he stepped outside that safe zone, professional fractures became clearer. This period recorded conflicts with project partners, tensions rising to the point of legal disputes. For Audie, collisions like these were not simply contract problems. They signaled that he had begun touching something Hollywood disliked. A man once boxed in, now trying to define himself. In 1959, he plunged back into the late-decade Western run. But this time, with an important difference. His roles began to take on a colder tone, less correct, less clean. The Wild and the Innocent, co-starring Sandra Dee, still served mainstream audiences, but Audie was no longer merely the spotless, heroic ballad. Cast a Long Shadow came with a detail suggesting he wanted more control, some level of uncredited involvement on the production side, a strategic backward step in an industry that prefers clearly assigned credit. No name on the bullet became a particularly telling proof. Here, Audie was praised for transforming into a cold-blooded killer. That role mattered because it shattered a stereotype that had followed him since To Hell and Back. Audie wasn't only capable of playing clean heroes. He could make people afraid. He could make them doubt. And that ability to unsettle audiences was the clearest sign that inside the monument, there was still an actor trying to break free, even though the cage of fame had closed long ago. As the 1960s began, the Western was no longer the secure throne it had been in the 1950s. Audiences changed, cinema changed, and new faces started pulling attention away from the quiet hero archetype Audie Murphy had come to represent. He still worked steadily, still appeared with stubborn consistency, but the pace of his career had shifted. He was no longer the center of a craze, but a name standing firm through reputation, a kind of star who no longer needed to be hyped, only to appear, and people would know exactly who he was. That silent shift made his life more vulnerable. Because when a star is no longer at the peak of the trend, everything outside cinema becomes more dangerous. Money, investments, taxes, things where fame offers no protection. And in 1968, the collapse arrived in the coldest way possible. Heavy losses in an Algerian oil venture, followed by trouble with the IRS. The man who had beaten the battlefield through survival instinct was now cornered by paperwork, numbers, and business mistakes that could not be corrected by courage. Bankruptcy did not merely shake his finances, it strangled the image of the hero who cannot fall, forcing him to face a bitter truth. Peace can kill a man in a slower, more merciless way than war. The year 1969 felt like an effort to keep himself from fully slipping off the cinematic rails. and A Time for Dying arrived late in his career like a final cut, still rooted in familiar Western territory, but the feeling was no longer the game of spotlight and glory. It felt like endurance, like clinging on. Audie kept working as long as he could stand on a film set, life had not completely collapsed. Then in 1970, something seemingly small became a pretext for people to scrutinize his private life. An altercation with dog trainer David Goffstein, followed by an investigation, before the matter was closed and charges were dropped. It did not turn him into a scandal figure, but it revealed an unspoken truth. Audie Murphy was no longer the boy of the 1950s. He had lived too long under tension outsiders couldn't see, yet it sat inside his reflexes, in the way a man reacts to sudden noise, in the way he constantly has to hold himself together so the fracture inside does not show. And sometimes a simple everyday collision is enough to expose that thin layer. Not because he liked trouble, but because some people return from war with an intact body, while the part called peace never comes back with them. If Hollywood was the place where Audie Murphy learned how to stand in front of a camera, then marriage was where he revealed most clearly a difficult truth. Some people return from war, but never truly return in their minds. And Wanda Hendricks was the first person to touch that part of his life. Not as an audience member or a fan, but as a wife living beside him every day. Wanda came from the very world Audie was being pulled into. Lights, shooting schedules, parties, social relationships considered normal in Hollywood. Their marriage in 1949, seen from the outside, looked like a perfect photograph. A war hero marrying a beautiful actress, as if America wanted to stamp happiness onto his life so the story could feel complete. But Audie did not enter marriage with an empty heart. He entered it with a nervous system locked tight by war, able to smile at the right moments in daylight, yet always stretched inside like a drawn wire. Living beside Wanda, Audie began to show the parts the public never saw: long-lasting insomnia, violent dreams, and a kind of vigilance that slowly wore domestic life down. Wanda was still young, still shaped by Hollywood's rhythm. So the silences inside that house were not peace. They felt like being pushed outside an inner world she had no key to enter. Audie was not the kind of man who could speak his fear out loud. He was trained to endure rather than to share. And that endurance, inside a marriage, turned into distance. They broke apart because ordinary life could not survive that constant tension. A wife who needed emotional presence, and a husband who seemed permanently on watch even when he was already home. The marriage ended in 1951. So quickly it felt like a single slash across a page. Audie Murphy could win a war, could become a national symbol, yet still could not save himself in private life, where no medal could help him sleep. Pamela Archer did not enter Audie Murphy's life through the kind of glamour Hollywood liked to manufacture. They met when Audie had already become too big a name to live normally. War turned him into a legend, cinema turned him into a brand, while his private world grew harder and harder to keep quiet. Pamela was a flight attendant, shaped by a world of discipline and control, accustomed to seeing tension hidden beneath polite surfaces. In Audie, that tension was not produced by fame. It came from memory. The relationship moved fast. Audie had just ended his first marriage to Wanda Hendricks, a short and unstable marriage that left him with the taste of failure at the very moment the public believed he was complete. Only days after the divorce, he married Pamela. Not out of recklessness, but because Audie understood exactly what he lacked: a life with structure, a woman who did not live by the stage, who did not feed love with noise. Pamela entered his life like a frame of a home, something Audie had never truly had: a childhood of hunger, a father who disappeared, a mother who died too early, and then a war that nearly swallowed the rest of his humanity. Pamela brought stability in a very practical sense, a family rhythm that ran on time, a home not dragged into the endless parties of the entertainment world, a wife who knew how to close the door when the outside world became too loud. Audie behaved with Pamela in a way completely different from the Western leading man the screen sold. He spoke little, rationed emotion, but attached himself with a stubborn kind of loyalty. Pamela didn't need him to be charming. She needed him there, and Audie did too. The birth of their 2 sons gave this marriage a meaning larger than love. Terry Michael Murphy was born in 1952. James Shannon Murphy was born in 1954, nicknamed Skipper, after Audie's close friend James Skipper Cherry. This naming a child after a best friend revealed something very clear in Audie, a deep need to turn family into a place where he could truly belong, where he could stand inside a small circle of trust instead of living forever as a symbol owned by an entire nation. Audie became a father in a way that surprised many people. He took his children to Universal Studios, fed them lunch in the studio cafeteria, let them see film sets as a reward for being good. At one point, Terry even appeared briefly in To Hell and Back as a very small child. This wasn't an ambition to make his son a child star. It was the instinct of a father wanting his children to enter his world without fear. Audie once said that being a father felt like living the childhood that had been taken from him. The sentence needed no decoration to reveal the hunger for normal life inside a man who had spent his entire existence at the edge of extremes. But family did not turn Audie into a man without darkness. It only gave him a reason to control that darkness more carefully. The chronic insomnia, battlefield dreams. At the startle responses of survival instinct still clung to him. In those days, there was no term like PTSD, so these symptoms were not seen as illness, but as a flaw to be hidden. Audie was stamped as a national hero, which meant he was not allowed to be weak. That pressure weighed on the marriage in a quiet, suffocating way. By day, he was disciplined and contained. By night, he became a body that refused to sleep, a nervous system that refused to lower its weapons. Pamela was the one who lived closest to that truth. She did not turn it into public tragedy. She endured it in the way practical women endure, making sure the children were raised and educated, keeping the home orderly, avoiding curious eyes, protecting the boys from becoming targets of sensational stories. Pamela could not heal the war inside Audie, but she created the minimum conditions that kept him from sliding completely out of life. A house with warmth, 2 children calling him father, a wife who knew when to stay silent and when to shield. The greatest suffering of this marriage did not lie in loud betrayal or the kind of wild indulgence the public likes to assume about Hollywood stars. The suffering lay in this: Pamela was loving a man whose most essential part was still trapped on the battlefield. His Audie could be deeply gentle with his sons, but he could also become rigid, easily triggered by small things. A person who has lived too long in constant vigilance cannot fully let go, even at home. Family sometimes became the place he wanted to cling to most, and the place he feared hurting most. In the late 1960s, economic pressure made the marriage heavier still. Failed investments, tax problems, major spending on horse racing pulled Audie into another kind of spiral. No longer fear inside nightmares, but fear in full daylight. Fear of not being able to provide for his wife and children. Fear of becoming a hero who could not even hold his family together materially. Pamela witnessed that decline from the closest distance. She could not carry his fame for him, but she had to carry the rhythm of life. On the afternoon of May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy was killed in a plane crash in Virginia. The Aero Commander 680 was flying in bad weather, heavy mountain fog, and slammed straight into the slope of Brush Mountain. 6 people died on impact, and he was only 45 years old, an ending so cruelly ironic it left people stunned. A soldier who had survived the most brutal campaigns in Europe, who once stood alone holding off an advancing enemy force amid flames and shredded metal, was brought down in a peacetime accident, without even a final word. His death immediately became a kind of national mourning in America's own way. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Murphy's grave later became one of the most visited sites at Arlington, second only to John F. Kennedy, because he wasn't merely an actor or a veteran, but a model hero America had built after World War II. Yet behind that solemn grandeur lay a very real family tragedy. Pamela Archer suddenly became a widow, and their 2 sons, Terry, 19, and James, 17, had to absorb the shock of losing their father while they were still teenagers. After the funeral, the family faced not only grief, but also a legal battle. Pamela and the boys pursued a lawsuit related to Audie's death, and in 1975, the court awarded the family roughly $2.5 million in compensation. And that money could not comfort anything, but it dealt with the most brutal reality after a sudden death. The living still have to go on, pay debts, raise children, keep a home, while the provider is gone forever. Pamela never remarried. She folded the rest of her life into the role of a mother and a guardian of memory. She worked for many years at a Veterans Administration hospital in Los Angeles in a patient support position, a choice shaped more by ethics than image. Instead of living off the title, the hero's widow, she stood beside other veterans in the very place Audie had spent much of his post-war life defending and speaking up for. The 2 sons grew up under the enormous shadow of their father. No noise, no scandal, no stepping into the spotlight to claim credit. They lived quietly, but carried the name Murphy like a lifelong reminder that their father's glory came with a price his children would bear in the years after him. Audie Murphy was gone, but America never stopped speaking his name. In modern history, a very few figures have made the word legend feel as concrete as Murphy did, not through storytelling, but through what he actually lived through: war, fame, and wounds no one could see. He rose from poverty in Texas, left school early, grew up in hunger and responsibility, only to become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. The campaigns in Sicily, the long path across North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and especially the moment on January 26, 1945, at Holtzwihr, when he held his position alone under overwhelming fire, turned a small young man into a national symbol. The country celebrated him as a living miracle, as proof that courage could surpass the limits of the human body. But Audie Murphy's legacy did not stop at battlefield heroism. He left behind something deeper: the truth of how a person can survive war and still never truly escape it. While America saw medals on his chest, Murphy fought sleepless nights, nightmares, survival reflexes that continued long after the guns fell silent. He was a symbol of victory, and at the same time a cold reminder: war does not end when the shooting stops. It can continue inside the body and nervous system of the soldier who lived through it. In Hollywood, he appeared in more than 40 films, becoming a familiar face in the Western genre, and To Hell and Back, 1955, turned him into a living monument in a way no one else could claim, replaying his own life on screen. The film was a major hit, cementing his fame, but also unintentionally trapping him inside the gunslinging hero mold for a long time. Audie Murphy proved that a soldier could become a star. but he also revealed a bitter truth. Fame cannot heal trauma. It only forces it to go silent, deeper, and longer. When he died in a plane crash in 1971, America held a funeral worthy of a legend. His grave at Arlington became one of the most visited sites, not out of curiosity, but because people saw something painfully real there. A man who gave his country everything he had and still died far too young. Afterward, his family, his wife Pamela Archer, his sons, chose to live quietly, preserving memory in the truest sense, not turning his name into merchandise, not turning grief into a stage. Audie Murphy does not live on because he was perfect. He lives on because he was one of the rare cases where light and darkness stood side by side with brutal clarity. Radiant heroism, a harsh private life, and an inner world that never found rest. And perhaps that is exactly why people still speak of him, like a legend, but also like a man. So do you still remember the moment about Audie Murphy that haunts you the most? His battlefield heroism or the pain he carried afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring the legendary lives behind the spotlight.